From your perspective, how does racism factor into climate change issues, and what can be done to specifically address the racist dimension of climate change issues?
So I'm from Chicago, which is one of the most segregated cities in the United States, and it was designed that way over 100 years ago. But since there hasn't been any proactive legislation to actually address this problem, and there are some even more insidious discriminatory policies used now, it ultimately results in the effects of climate change not being distributed equally. So for example, because of modern city zoning practices, a lot of predominantly Black and Brown communities are more likely to have highways, factories, and distribution centers placed within them, which traps in the heat and pollution and has devastating health effects, whether it relates to obesity, asthma, or heart disease. Whereas white communities are more likely to have parks and trees, which actually cool down their neighborhoods. And so there was actually a report recently that showed that communities of color in Chicago are about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter on average, whereas white communities are about 5 degrees cooler on average in the summer. And so we see how this really affects us when it comes to natural disasters, whether it's heat waves like in 1995, there was a historic one that ultimately disproportionately killed communities of color. And now we see it with COVID-19, where all the things I listed, obesity, asthma, heart disease, are pre-existing conditions for COVID-19. So I think that any legislation that tackles climate change has to be aware of these disparities. Personally, I support the carbon dividends framework because I think it can address multiple facets of the socioeconomic effects of climate change at once. It has a carbon tax that will reduce carbon emissions that hit minority communities the hardest. The revenues from the tax would be given back to the American people via a dividend, which would be a net benefit for the vast majority of families. And it could also spur a lot of sustainable energy construction that can not only employ workers, but can change the livelihoods of people through better transportation or just cleaner air and better health impacts. So I don't think it's the only solution, but I think it's a great first step to address multiple things at once.